Hi, everyone. Welcome to Building AI Solutions with Trust by Design, featuring Connor Jensen and Oz Karan. We're super excited that you've all joined us today. Just one quick housekeeping note is that a recording of the session will be available to you after. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it on over to Connor and Oz.
Morning, everybody. Good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. We'll do a couple quick introductions, then we'll launch in. Thank you, everybody, for joining. My name is Connor Jensen. I am the Global Field CDO at Dataiku. We'll get into that a little bit. If you're not familiar with Dataiku, we are a data science and analytics development platform. We'll talk a little bit about that here in the future. Been here for 5 years. Led our data science team, led our field CDO team for the last couple of years. We work with our customers as advisors on strategic topics and how they're working about building AI products. Excited to be here today. Oz, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you, Connor, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. My name is Oz Karan. I'm a partner with our risk and financial advisory practice at Deloitte. I lead our trustworthy AI services and market offering. So in that capacity, thinking about all the risk governance and controls considerations associated with these emerging technologies like AI and generative AI, and very excited for the session here in the next 30 minutes.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. All right, well, let's dive in. So what we're going to do here today, I'm going to talk a little bit first around some of the broader generative AI trends and things that we're seeing, and especially how that's contributing to the conversation around trust and sort of as that is evolving right now. Oz is going to give a little bit of perspective, especially digging into the trusted pieces like that. And then we're going to do a little bit of a fireside chat going back and forth. So diving right in at the start here, the first thing that we're seeing as a conversation that's really changed going into this year, coming out of last year, is really the conversation around the compute cost volatility and leveraging GPUs and the advantage, but the struggle that's going along with that. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, just in case, GPU originally it's a graphic processor unit. So originally you would have within your computer, you still have a CPU, which does all of your compute, running things like your OS and your applications, but you had a GPU that was managing the graphics and what was happening on screen, and those were developed in a different way to deal with the load of computing, what was going to happen from a graphical perspective. What's turned out over the last 10 years is that GPUs are also really good for handling machine learning, deep learning, AI computations, especially now over the last 5 or 6 years as people have moved into neural nets. And one flavor of neural nets that we're hearing a lot about right now, LLMs, is that these GPUs are especially efficient at handling the large text type data sets for lit text generation. But why is this causing volatility? Well, GPUs have been becoming more influential. Probably I'd say really over the last 5 to 6 years is where you've sort of started to see them as mainstream, or at least sort of like a clear secondary usage in the AI and ML space in developing these AI applications. And that parallel processing that they're able to do is crucial for doing these large language models and generative AI. Well, of course, there's been a huge embrace of the foundation models and the other types of LLMs and generative AI models over the last year, especially, where the demand for the compute processing power these GPUs can provide, especially hosted by the public clouds, is really outstripping the supply side of things. And so this surging demand, especially driven by the adoption of generative AI, with uncertain supply, right? The semiconductor supply chain has had a lot of turbulence over the last few years, as pretty much all supply chains have, but especially with, there are some choke points here in the semiconductor for the specific types of chips necessary for GPUs. And then, of course, we are seeing supply chain impacts on this from global uncertainties. And so all this is combining to really sort of drive a different conversation around what you can trust and use and leverage from this. And actually, now we're really starting to see conversations of people moving back to hybrid architectures, thinking about building on-prem supplies of their own, trying to control this themselves. Another dynamic of this is that as people are leveraging these generative AI models more and more, most of this is happening currently today via the commercial API-driven services like OpenAI, Cohere, Anthropic, and then, of course, the cloud-provided ones like Bedrock or Vertex. And so as those are really becoming more and more leveraged, we're really starting to see even sometimes a lack of availability and an increase in cost of those. And so people are looking now actually to go back a little bit the direction away from the cloud first option into thinking about building their own on-prem architectures a little bit. And so as people were pursuing generative AI more and more, this thought around how do I control for these costs and this uncertainty right now around GPUs is a really important issue from a business trust perspective, to be able to trust that you can leverage these technologies at scale. But secondly, the other piece that's happening right now is it's sort of all the conversation right now feels like we're talking about large language models, but where do they really fit in? It kind of today feels a little bit like generative AI and LLMs is everything you should be doing from a AI perspective, right? This should be your focus. We're having conversations with our customers or prospects around what is your Gen AI strategy, right? And it sort of feels like this is a brand new thing that is a completely dominant part of the ecosystem. But really, the generative AI and the LLMs are a piece of the puzzle, but they're just one piece of a larger puzzle where we have AI, we have machine learning, we have neural networks, we have NLP, which feeds into this, computer vision, also part of the generative AI stack, deep learning, the type of architectures, neural networks and everything, and then we have generative AI LLMs. And so all of these are fitting together, and there's a lot of sort of overlap and distinction between these, but I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that we need to be thinking about these generative AI tools, while they are bringing new capabilities to the fore, that they are part of our overall AI and data science landscape, and that we need to be thinking of them in this broader overall architecture. And the third piece that I think is really coming and has hit home in the last, I'd say maybe 3 to 4 months, as people have moved out. I guess the early movers have moved out of the prototype and POC phase into really putting in some generative AI models into production, is how do we manage these LLMs, right? And so the couple things that I think are important to note here, and I realize there's a lot on this slide, but just sort of think about how do we pull apart the LLM itself and the AI service layers, and really be able to think about things like auditing, PII detection, content moderation, cost tracking, and divorcing that from the LLM itself, right? As we think about being able to be more modular, those sort of service and ancillary layers that go around that are becoming really important. And then, of course, securitization, auditing, ensuring safe use, controlling who can access which LLM with which data, how are they doing that? This is a really important, and I'd say struggling challenge here, especially because the external nature of leveraging a lot of the Gen AI tools, it's different than what we've mostly been doing, which has been managing and maintaining our own AI models locally for the vast majority of the use cases. And so it's changing a little bit the paradigm in which we're working and how much we're having to go and think about managing AI products in a different way. And to actually sort of dive straight into that, I'm going to hand it over to Oz here to sort of talk about what some of that can look like on the management side.
Great, thank you, Connor. So as Connor mentioned, the rate of technology advancement is now increasing faster than perhaps human ability to adapt it. And not only a pace of change has changed, but the volume of data is increasing rapidly as well. So in the conversations that I usually participate in my role, I experience two different types of organizations. One in the kind of the path of fear that's dominated by headlines that AI is going to take over the world and it's going to challenge humanity and it's coming for us all, and it's one that is paralyzing because of that fear. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, the path of idealism. It's the part where we run headlong into the possibility of a future that's really bright around these emerging technologies. It's going to cure cancer. It's going to solve world problems and make the world a better place, and so forth and so on. So under both of these scenarios, regardless of who you talk in an organization, regardless of their role in the organization, one word that constantly comes up in conversations more than any other word is trust. And what does it mean to have trust in the AI that we're going to kind of living with? So we've decided that we don't want to be just talking about it, about the word trust, but we actually measured it. So our Trust ID generative AI study has actually revealed that if your organization is experimenting with some of these emerging technologies, that lowers the level of trust. In certain cases, the consumers that know that the brand is using AI is 144% less likely to trust that brand. The perception of reliability for that brand, that decreases by about 157%. And if you think about the overall organization, the employee trust by the employers in that organization also decreases by 139%. So despite the kind of this widespread skepticism around these emerging technologies, the field is rapidly expanding and growing, but it also requires the companies to adapt find new ways to really grow that trust when AI is utilized by their organizations. If you can go to the next slide, please. So we talked about AI, generative AI, machine learning, deep learning, all of this stuff. But how do we kind of think about the erosion of trust with these emerging technologies? I think we all know that there are some existing risks from AI, whether that's bias, that some of these AI algorithms trained on biased data can perpetuate discrimination areas like hiring or loan approvals or even criminal justice. So identifying and mitigating bias is crucial to ensure fairness and equal opportunity when it comes to these emerging technologies. Privacy is another one. Some of these systems that collect and analyze vast amounts of personal data really raise privacy concerns. So balancing innovation with data protection becomes extremely essential. Transparency and explainability. Some of these complex emerging technologies can make opaque decisions. Lack of transparency makes it difficult to understand their reasoning and raising concerns about accountability and fairness. And then insert generative AI into our lives, right? In the last two years or so. Now we're talking about deepfakes, manipulated videos or audio, which can incredibly be convincing and blurring the lines between truth and fiction, and poses another major risk for spreading misinformation and propaganda and eroding trust in society. Some of the unpredictable and unreliable outputs, ensuring that the quality and the reliability of generative AI outputs can be challenging. Models can produce harmful and offensive, inaccurate content if not carefully controlled or monitored. So these are some of the risks that we are really dealing with in today's environment. And the big question becomes, what can organizations really do? What steps they can take to mitigate these risks and really build that trust with their employees, with their customers, and with various different stakeholders. What you're seeing on the right side of the slide is some of these different risk mitigation techniques, whether that's establishing a comprehensive AI risk management framework, having the right policy and procedures in place, really thinking about the different risks within the AI lifecycle, or from design to development to actual training and use case, and so forth and so on. So with that, let's maybe we think about, maybe there's a third path. It doesn't have to be the path of fear and path of idealism, and maybe there's a third path. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And that's really the path of being able to have the right mechanisms in place to be able to instill more trust in these machines and more trust with humans related to these machines and related to these emerging technologies. So one of those items is having a comprehensive AI risk management principles that would serve as the cornerstone of your AI journey for your organization. What you're seeing on the slide is our trustworthy AI framework that we have developed at Deloitte, that we don't not only deploy with our own internal machines and models, but we also bring this to our clients as well. There's a lot of different frameworks out there that you can also utilize. National Institute of Science and Technology has their own framework. Some of the big tech organizations have come up with their own framework. But what you really see is that consistently across, these are some of the principles that those frameworks really hone in on, whether that's the safety and security, how the AI systems can be protected from some of these risks that we can talk about. accountability, what kind of policies that an organization needs to have in place to determine who's responsible for that, decisions that are being made and drive through the use of these emerging technologies. Transparency and explainability, we talked about, how do participants are able to really understand how their data is being used and how these emerging technologies are making decisions through the use of that data. So one of the key advice that we give our clients is that really start with understanding what are those key framework components that you want to instill in your organization that's going to help you build that trust. And if you go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we really honed in on the article that we published along with Dataiku and Opportunity to Build Trust is some of these items that outlines what are some of the key things that organizations really think about. As more and more use cases we see related to these emerging technologies, we also see an increasing number of regulations. So adhering to those regulations, really understanding the organization's obligations in meeting those regulatory requirements related to use of AI and generative AI becomes extremely important and extremely challenging. Establishing controls, what are the different types of risks that you really need to control for, again, through the entire life cycle of these emerging technologies, and being able to build your control environment that's going to be able to mitigate towards those risks. It becomes extremely critical. Communication with stakeholders, I cannot highlight the importance of this enough. We see a lot of organizations out there think that this is just a challenge of the technology organizations or data organizations, but it really becomes a cross-organizational challenge, and communication with those stakeholders across the organization becomes extremely important. And obviously the last one is the trust element. How do you how do you ensure you instill additional transparency, explainability to the process to instill that trust with your various different stakeholders that participate in your AI journey. So with that, Connor, maybe let me turn it over to you with a question. One of the key questions that I get in my role is really thinking about who in the organization is responsible for the story of AI, generative AI, of these emerging technologies. What do you see in your conversations in the organizations that you speak with? Who do you usually see in the organization is really responsible for the AI agenda?
So I'll start with saying that there's unfortunately not consistency yet in terms of like how companies are addressing it. But I think that's reflected in just sort of the maturity of overall organizations, and what we've seen, and I'd say sort of seen anecdotally, but then borne out a lot in the survey that we did with Databricks last year, and some other recent findings, is that the companies that are being the most successful with building this trust, building out and leveraging these things, have somebody on the C-suite whose job it is to manage their data and AI initiatives, right? And I think that role is still sort of evolving and shaping, right? Some companies have just a chief data officer. Some companies have a chief data and analytics officer. Some have a chief analytics officer, a chief data officer, and a chief data and analytics officer, right? And so it's like there's definitely still sort of we're fumbling a little bit to what that right model looks like. But regardless of name, the thing that is really key is that, I in a conversation with a friend a few years ago, he made I'll say a snide, but like truthful remark, and that a CDO was a fake chief executive, right? Was a fake CXO. Because a lot of times in that organization, a CDO is under the CIO who is under the COO, or even further down, right? And so, having a CDO or some analog to it, right, regardless of what you're calling it, is important. But if that's somebody who's 3 or 4 layers down in the organization, then they're going to get as much attention to this as that position sort of warrants, right? And so I think that's the first and the foremost is, do you have somebody who's reporting to the CEO, or maybe at most is, one step away under a COO or that sort of organizational hierarchy, whose job it is first, when they wake up in the morning and when they go to bed at night, and then every moment in between, that AI and data is the focus of what they're doing. That's the first and the foremost one. But the thing that I don't want that answer to give the impression of is that everybody else gets a free pass, right? That if you're serious as an organization with making AI and data and sort of like the broader, that we're talking about here, if you're serious about making this part of what you do as a company, it is everybody's responsibility to be part of it. And I mean, everybody, from the person who is sitting in a call center typing data in, what they put into those fields when they're on the phone with the customer or whatever will flow through to every model and every decision that comes downstream from that. Their managers, are they thinking about that? Are they leveraging that? When they're training people, are they helping them understand the importance of the data that they put in? Your mid-managers, where sort of all good initiatives either succeed or fail, right? Like, are they bought in? Do they understand the importance of what their teams are doing, how they're contributing? Are they messaging down? When they're hiring new salespeople, are they looking for salespeople who have experience in working with data and working with, lead scoring models or other sales? Like, if this is, again, I'm not saying that every company should make AI a core part of their strategy, right? Like, you have to decide as a company, right? Like, you can only be sort of one thing centric, right? Some companies are customer centric, companies are product centric, some companies are AI centric, right? And so you have to decide how important this is and what level of initiative you're going to give into it. The first piece is that there's somebody whose job it is that has the organizational wide remit and authority to make good on it, but that they're then enabled by every other person at every layer, up, down, sideways, to make sure that they're able to do that. So yeah. I'd say it's the yin and the yang, right? Like, somebody has to have that sort of central authority, but also everybody else has to be a part of it.
I've also seen the organizations that really experiment in any capacity with AI that form some type of a steering committee type of a governance structure that has representation from different parts of the organization, becoming very successful at this. There should be a seat at the table for HR as much as there's a seat at the table for technology or legal or data. Because what you're really trying to do is bring that collective mindset to the table to say different use cases the organization may be experimenting with, the governance protocols that they may be thinking about establishing, policies, procedures that they're thinking about establishing should really be reviewed and thought about with someone in each of those organizations to bring that mindset to the table. And in my experience, those are the organizations that really do this in a right way and be able to really control for those risks, as opposed to organizations that think that this is just a really should be on the top of the agenda for technology or data or some of those organizations that really deal with the AI and generative AI. And then the last thing I would add is I've also seen a proliferation of the role AI data and ethics officer. Ethics component is really being built into some of these roles, whether it's with the CDO or a new role being created in an organization, because that governance and ethics component becomes a huge challenge for those organizations that are experimenting with AI and generative AI or any of these emerging technologies.
One of the things I think is really interesting, especially about this ethics angle here, is that as we start in a much more explicit way than we have in the past, encoding historical decisions into data and then automating them, or at least making them far more transparent via AI, I think it's forcing organizations to examine their ethics in a way that there has not always been. I don't want to say there never has been, but there rarely has been something that makes it so tangible. As when you sit down and you look at, and HR is always a good one that sort of comes up these conversations. When you sit down and you want to look at how do we improve our DEI initiatives, sitting down and actually sort of looking at the numbers, looking at the stuff is a good first start that organizations haven't always been forced to sort of reckon with. And once you start saying, hey, we think that there's an AI or a data product that we can build here, the first thing you do is you look at what the data is telling you historically, and then that sort of makes organizations come to a much more concrete statement about their ethics than was really historically sort of like implicit, not necessarily like explicit, right? And so you talked a lot about the trust, and so that's, I think that this is like a really natural sort of like loop. Then it like, there's what an organization chooses to do when it sits down and looks at like what are our, we'll call it our ethical decisions as an organization historically. But then of course we have the EU and the new EU AI Act. We have the statement that came out from the White House last year, and assumedly more regulation coming in the United States beyond that. And you know, obviously you support the financial services sector, which is historically pretty regulated in some aspects of what it does. And, you know, likewise in healthcare, and there are other regulated, highly regulated industries. But like, how do you see that evolution of this regulatory discussion forcing more ethical discussion? Like, what does that look like to you?
Yeah, great question. You know, one thing that's pretty apparent, I think, over the last few months here is that we are seeing an increasing number of regulations coming both at the local, state, as well as federal level, both in the US and globally. So what I see in the US, first of all, is that we're actually probably going to see more and more at the local and state level than maybe we do at the federal level. You know, obviously the White House came up with the AI Bill of Rights and the executive order and all that stuff. But what we are seeing actually is some tangible local regulations like we see in the city of New York. If you are using models for hiring decisions, now those models needs to be audited and reviewed on an annual basis. Or in the state of Colorado, if you're a life insurer in the state of Colorado, you have certain obligations to the state of Colorado now that you have to comply with as well. So we are seeing more tangible stuff at maybe the more mid to local and state level than we do on the federal level in the US. But if you turn the lens to global, then you're seeing the EU AI Act that's very tangible in EU and has a lot of different requirements. We're seeing stuff happening in Japan, in Brazil, in China. So, obviously I don't have a crystal ball, and the type of industry that you operate in is going to have a different answer for this question, perhaps. But what I suspect is that we're going to see an increasing number of regulations going forward at both local, state, and federal level across the globe. And the more of these regulations come to play, there's going to be more obligations for organizations to really comply with. And that kind of the regulatory change management process related to these emerging technologies is going to become more and more critical for chief compliance officers and chief risk officers and so forth and so on. So that's where I think where we're going. But obviously, who would have known that we would be here where we are today 18 months ago?
Well, and I think it goes, that last point especially goes right back to what you were saying around having the steering committees and that, like, sort of, we certainly see that the companies that are being the most successful are doing use cases across the organization in a wider number of parts of their work, right? Because it's bringing more people to the table and sort of fostering that culture of innovation. But then, like, wider also means harder to manage. And so it is an interesting sort of like push and pull of, you want to be doing it in your workforce management in HR. You want to be doing it in operations. You want to be doing it in, sales and go-to-market, and like all these different parts of the business that can benefit. But then, like, how do you balance right now the, like, let's move with, if we get out over our skis and then regulation sort of like cuts out from underneath. And it's like, I get that sort of tension from the companies, but I think that there's, typically we try to sort of like think from a regulation perspective, there's plenty of influence from the business side there to say, like, how do we do this intelligently? And so I think that, we should be looking to regulation to help make it clearer for the bounds of what people can and should be doing, but with not at the cost right now of waiting, right? And so that would be the sort of the piece that I would, to those out there listening, like, the more you work towards it right now, the better position you'll be in when the regulations come at that local or state level, because you'll know what you're doing, what you're working on, you'll have your arms wrapped around this situation. So awesome. Well, I know it was a quick conversation, Oz, but a blast and a great way to start my Monday here. So I really hope that everybody else has enjoyed this as much as I have.
Same here.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.